Okay, today we're going to talk about the conflict between the radical Republicans in Congress and President Andrew Johnson during Reconstruction. And before we can do anything else, we need to get a little bit of a background on who Johnson was, what he was about. To start, he was from Tennessee. He is actually a senator from Tennessee before becoming vice president, uh, and he supported the Union, which is one of the reasons why he ended up becoming vice president. He was the only senator from a state that had seceded from the Union to stay in Congress when the rest left. So he was literally the only senator that chose to remain in the Union from a seceded state. He was elected as a Democrat into the Senate, but he was Lincoln's vice president as a symbolic gesture, sort of as a gesture of reunification. So that's why he was chosen to be vice president, even though he didn't really agree with some of the things that Lincoln did. Uh, he believed that Reconstruction, or the goal of Reconstruction, should be to restore the Union to how it was before the war. He wasn't overly excited about equal rights or any of those ideas that radical Republicans or Republicans in general were very excited about. But when he became president, he was still able to convince both some Democrats in the South and Republicans in the North, based on the ideas that he had and the things that he had said in the past. Both sides thought that he was going to favor them a little bit more, and you'll see what exactly that turns into in just a minute. In this political cartoon, right away you can see Republicans weren't going to be too happy. Johnson did own slaves at one point, but they were house slaves. He was never a planter, so he wasn't really part of that plantation culture, and in fact, he really disliked uh, rich planters, the very wealthy, and that almost aristocracy in the South. He accepted emancipation. He was fine with ending slavery, but he didn't believe that black suffrage, voting rights, could be forced onto southern states. He thought that the states would have to come around on their own, and that the federal government couldn't decide whether or not a state should allow black suffrage or not. Uh, Straight up, Johnson was a white supremacist. Despite this, because he still hated the wealthy planter class in the South, he wanted to keep them out of power for a time, and one of the ways that he could do that was to remove their slave workforce, their slave labor. That would take away a little bit of their income, take away a little bit of their power. So he was fine doing that. And he went along with Republicans insofar as that he wanted to keep those wealthy planters out of power, out of office. And considering they had most of the political power before, he was able to keep them out of office by passing the laws that Republicans really wanted passed. Unfortunately, when given the opportunity to help African Americans by signing legislation extending funding for things like the Freedmen's Bureau, or passing a civil rights bill to counteract the black codes, which we'll talk about in a minute, he chose instead to veto those. We'll come back to that. If you could take a look at this political cartoon here, you'll see the depiction of Johnson just kicking over the Freedmen's Bureau. It's a little bureau there with the word Freedman on it, and you can see people falling out of it. You could tell if you see the entire picture, it's him kicking it down a staircase. He's not particularly on the side of the Freedmen's Bureau. It's pretty clear. Because Congress was in recess when Johnson took office after Lincoln was assassinated, Congress was away and they didn't come back until December. So for a number of months, Johnson was actually in charge. He ran Reconstruction for a period of months, and because of that, he had a lot of time to install his own policies. And one of the things that he did, as part of one of those policies, is that he offered a pardon to any white Southerners who swore oaths of loyalty to the Union. So that was one big piece of his Reconstruction plan. He offered a pardon, amnesty, to any of the white Southerners who swore oaths of loyalty to the Union, unless they were a high-ranking official when they were in the Confederacy, or they had a certain amount of income, a certain amount of wealth. He wasn't, at that point, if you were in that second category there, you need to appeal directly to the president, so meaning directly to him, in order to receive a pardon. that was part one of his plan. He also appointed provisional governors in the southern states, so not elected, but he appointed provisional governors in the southern states who were charged with coming up with new state constitutions that banned slavery and outlawed secession. However, only white Southerners who took the oath were allowed to vote under this plan, which kept freedmen from being able to vote. So this disappointed Republicans. There were three motives that prompted Johnson's Reconstruction program. The first, like Lincoln, Johnson wanted to restore the southern states as functioning members of the Union as soon as possible. To him, this was the supreme purpose of the Civil War, whereas the future status of African Americans was secondary. For both constitutional and practical reasons, it should be left to the states. So he really didn't believe that slavery was the key issue here. Like Lincoln, he wanted to preserve the Union. That was, primary goal number one. Second, he wanted to transfer political power in the South from the planters to the commoners. We've sort of toyed with this idea already. He didn't like the planter class. He wanted to move the power back to the common men, which there were many more of. And that was through the disenfranchisement clauses of that amnesty proclamation. So what I mean by that is what we had talked about, what I just said about how if you had a certain amount of money, you had to appeal directly for a pardon. That was his way of sort of pushing the vote and pushing the power back to the common people, because if you had too much money, you wouldn't be able to vote right away. He would have to allow that. Black suffrage, so black voting rights, as he saw it, would upset that objective, because the majority of blacks, even though they were free, would remain economically bound to the big planters. Think about like the sharecropping system, and they would be able to be controlled politically by the wealthy. So he was worried that by emancipating slaves, that's one thing, but if you were to give freedmen the vote, that vote would be basically counted towards whatever the wealthy wanted, because they would be controlling the freedmen vote. They'd be controlling those people who and force them to vote the way that they would want to. Third, he had hoped to be elected president in 1868 in his own right, meaning not because of an assassination, by promoting what he believed most Americans wanted, which was sectional reconciliation, getting the South and the North back together, and opposing what he was sure most of them didn't want, which was black equality. He was trying to, he believed that most people in the country didn't think that equality was a good thing, so he opposed that. So he was trying to set himself up for his election. For part one, the quick pardons and provisional governors helped. He got the governors in there, brought the Union back together, and he pardoned a lot of people very quickly. So that helped him as far as trying to bring the Union back together and trying to transfer power. That was good. Part two was harder to accomplish. Johnson didn't want the radical Republicans to be able to change too much in the South, so he wanted Reconstruction to move quickly so they wouldn't have a chance to do anything. He also needed Southern support for his re-election, so he tried to make Southerners happy when possible, and through his excessive pardoning, so he got to the point where he was pardoning hundreds of people a day from the wealthy class, he allowed ex-Confederate politicians to regain political office. So that wasn't good, really, anybody but the rich Southern planters. Okay, I need to mention, at least for a moment, something called black codes. Southern legislatures removed slave codes, so because they were forced to, because there weren't slaves anymore. But they removed the slave codes by changing the word slave to the word freedman. And these new codes were called black codes, and they forced former slaves to do things like carry ID papers and observe a curfew, and it restricted their right to vote as well. Northerners believed that black codes were the first step by Southerners to return African Americans to slavery, and they also believed that Johnson's pardon policy did not hold anyone responsible for the war, so therefore the Republican majority in Congress halted Johnson's plan. So between his pardon policy and the black codes and his willingness to allow the provisional governors and ex-Confederates to return to office, Congress was fed up they wanted to stop Johnson's plan and install their own plan. At the point when Johnson vetoed the extension of the Freedmen's Bureau, remember I mentioned that a little while ago, and the Civil Rights Bill, which was supposed to stop the black codes from being able to work very well, Republicans in Congress decided to enact the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed the civil rights of all U.S. citizens and included all African Americans as citizens if they were born in this country. Johnson tried to block that legislation. He tried to stop the 14th Amendment and urged southern state legislatures to vote against the law. And he tried to present his case to northern voters as well by visiting communities across the North, but audiences rejected his views. In the 1866 midterm elections, radicals and moderates whom Johnson denounced in his little tour of the North won re-election handily, and the Republican majority grew to 2/3 of both houses of Congress, which means that when Republicans vote together, that's a veto-proof majority. They can pretty much do whatever they want without having to worry about Johnson overruling them at this point. And they use that supermajority to pass the Reconstruction Acts in both 1867 and 1868. The first one, which was passed in 67, returned all of the ex-Confederate states to the Union and established 5 military districts that would be supervised by U.S. Army generals. And the generals were there to supervise elections. Since another section of the bill allowed all freedmen to vote, they were there to ensure that that voting right was observed. Congress also passed laws to limit Johnson's power, first by passing a law requiring the president to issue military orders through the general of the army, who was Ulysses S. Grant, a Republican. So any movement by the military would have to be approved by Grant. And then they also passed something called the Tenure of Office Act. This one's going to be important. This gave the Senate the power to approve changes in the cabinet. So if Johnson wanted to change any of the members of his cabinet, he would have to get Senate approval. And all of these bills, the Tenure of Office Act, the bill requiring the president to issue military orders through the General of the Army, and the Reconstruction Acts, all had to be passed over Johnson's veto. So they passed it and went to Johnson. He vetoed them all, and then it goes back to Congress, and Congress overturned the veto with a 2/3 majority in both houses. Because Johnson was losing power, he fought back. He increased the power of the civilian governments in each state, the ones that he had installed with those provisional governors, and he limited the military power in the South as much as possible by removing military commanders who were enforcing that new law, and tried to remove Secretary of War Stanton, who was a Republican sympathizer, from his cabinet. That's the one that really pushed radical Republicans over the edge and led to the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. In 1868, radical Republicans for the 3rd time brought impeachment charges against Johnson. Impeachment meaning, bringing formal charges against the president with the possibility of being able to remove him from office. And in this time, the 3rd time, they succeeded in getting the votes in order to actually impeach him. They concentrated on his violation of the Tenure of Office Act because he tried to fire Stanton without their approval. And it was a nice clear-cut example of how he was not doing what he was supposed to do according to the law. His trial lasted for over 3 months, and although there was support for removing him from office, Republicans felt one vote short of succeeding. And Johnson, although still in office now, was severely weakened by the event, so his political power was all but done. And you can take a look at this political cartoon here. You'll see, this is, those of you reading Julius Caesar, you can see the similarity here. We've got a scene that is sort of taken from Julius Caesar, where you have the senators in the background there, right in the middle of the picture, cheering on with Andrew Jackson lying dead as the Caesar. The title of this cartoon is called The Political Death of the Bogus Caesar, and you can see up in the top left where it says treason is a crime and must be punished. That's a sign on the wall there. This cartoon pretty much demonstrates that the end of Johnson as a political actor, as a politician. As a result of his impeachment, he is completely without power. And when going to the Democratic convention to be renominated to become president, he comes in second in the first round of voting on who would become the nominee for the Democrats, and he pretty much fades into obscurity after that convention. So that pretty much shows the end of the conflict between Johnson and the radical Republicans. He leaves office, Grant becomes president as a Republican, and Reconstruction continues in the Republican brand. So that's it. If you have any questions, I know this was a little bit of a long video, apologize for that. There was a lot of information. If you have questions, please leave a comment, and we'll talk about it in class.